Thank you, Liz. And thank you for inviting us here this evening to let us share this time with our clients and our friends. As Liz said, we had a great time this afternoon with the advisors, with your advisors, a great session of exchange. That really helps us a lot, and hopefully you can benefit from that. Some of the things we hear are your issues, are your questions. So that comes back to us, and it helps in formulating strategy for us, because we need to understand where you are. But I'd like to point out something. Liz mentioned that my undergraduate degree is in economics, and economics is known as the dismal science. So I just want to set the record straight that it reminds me, and my wife reminds me of this too. It's an anecdote about a woman who walks into her physician's office, and the physician says, "I've got some bad news for you. You have 6 months to live." The woman hangs her head and says, "Well, what do you recommend?" And the physician looks at her and says, "I recommend that you marry an economist and move to Winnipeg." So she drops her head again and says, "Well, how is that going to help me?" And the physician says to her, "It won't help you, but it'll make 6 months feel like forever." So with that in mind, what I'd like to do is point out the outline of what I'd like to accomplish tonight. So first of all, answer the overarching question, is this a sustainable recovery? What we'll do is go through macroeconomic overview, give you a perspective on the macroeconomy, look at capital markets, how all this relates to capital markets, but then also relate it to your investments and how this gets tied together in some of the advice that you'll be getting from us and some of the things that we're doing for you. And along those lines, we've been following over the last year and a half 4 specific factors that we think are key to understanding whether or not we're in a recovery and whether it's sustainable. The first of those is U.S. housing markets. So we'll go into some depth on that. The second is U.S. consumer demand. The third one we'll look at is U.S. bank stability. And the fourth is global credit markets and the stability of global credit markets. So we'll go through that in a little more detail. But I'd like to frame it that way so that we're using the understanding of how these factors will affect our decisions about investments and also yours for your investments. But I am, and it brings to mind that I'm always cautious when I'm doing these kinds of presentations about the use of analogy and the use of metaphor. It's never easy to get complex ideas across, and sometimes metaphor and analogy are helpful. But I learned a lesson long ago when I was working as an investment counselor. I had my 5-year-old daughter say, "Daddy, bring your parent to kindergarten day. Would you come with me?" And of course I said yes. So the night before, we were sitting down at dinner, and I said, "Charlotte, I'm going with you to kindergarten tomorrow. Do you know what I do?" And she looked at me and said, "No." I said, "Well, I'm an investment counselor." So at that time I was working with private clients, helping them with their portfolios. So I said to her, "Do you know what that is?" And she said, "No." So I thought, here's my chance. Try it with a 5-year-old, use some analogy, see if you can get the point across. So I started to think of it this way. When you're sick, we take you to the doctor, and the doctor helps you get better. When people's money is sick, they take it to me, and I help their money get better. And I looked at her and said, "Does that help you to understand?" And she looked at me and said, "Okay." So I figured this works. Analogy works. 5-year-olds, adults. So the next day we trot off to kindergarten in the morning, hand in hand to the front of the class. We're standing there, and the teacher says, "Charlotte, who do you have with you today?" And she said, "My daddy." And the teacher said, "And what does he do?" And Charlotte said, "He takes money from sick people." So that's my warning to you. I've learned this lesson, but I'll still, at my peril, use some analogies tonight. I'd like to focus quickly on a quote that was made 2 years ago. Neil Ferguson, who has a joint appointment at the Harvard Business School and the Harvard History Department, called what we were going through at the time the Great Repression. And he called it a depression denied. And I'll go through some of the things about why it is not a depression, why it's not similar to the Great Depression on one hand, but that it is on another hand. And I'd like to take you back to 2 years ago, a month and 2 years ago, to what was going on in the headlines then. I'll draw your attention to the middle headline there. September 15th, 2008, Lehman Brothers failed. And that was the beginning of it all. Our lives all changed that day as investors, but I can tell you in our offices, I sat with our group, with my colleagues and said, having lived through 1987 and a lot of other issues, said, remember what's going on right now because this is history. Not necessarily great history, but it is history in terms of what's happening to financial markets. And it is true. We will look back on this 10 years from now and there will be studies done on what was going on at the time. I'm going to take you through some of that so to try and give a context to where we are today. But the important thing is it wasn't that long ago that we were in this situation. But I'd also like to take you to a different place, to London, and think about a Friday afternoon, 4:30, half an hour before the bank closes, and a young banker, Henry Thornton, is hoping that the bank doors are going to close before his bank fails. There's a run on the bank, and it needs to close at 5 while he's still solvent, or the bank will fail. And sure enough, the doors close. And it gives him time, and the bank is still solvent. It gives him time over the weekend to go to the central bank in England and negotiate what is essentially a $4 billion overnight loan to be able to float the bank Monday morning so that he can open the doors. Doors open Monday morning. The bank stays solvent all day, and in fact, it continues to be solvent, and the problem is solved. Interesting story. The most interesting part of this story is that the December I'm talking about was 1825. And the point of that is this has been going on for centuries. We have these kinds of upheavals, these difficult times in markets that will continue to plague us as we go forward. It's just a matter of negotiating and understanding where things are going to make good decisions about how to put investments to work. So that's part of the groundwork I'd like to put in perspective for you as we talk about the macroeconomy. So what's important about the economy? It's really about growth. So here on the slide, we have the International Monetary Fund's projection for global growth. And by the way, we have put the slides in a booklet for you. I'm not going to go through all of the slides tonight, so they're not all going to be there, but most of the slides are in that book. If there are any that you're interested in afterwards in discussing, be glad to talk with you about it, but be careful what you wish for, because this is good stuff, but I'm saving some of it for another time. Anyway, here we have what the International Monetary Fund is projecting out to 2014 in terms of global growth. So as you can see, it's around 4.6%, which is roughly around the average of 2003 to 2007. So that's interesting, but that's the global economy. If we start looking at why it's important to look at the global economy, and we're going to look at what's important, key is to say what makes up the global economy. Well, Canada ranks about 10th in global economy. Canada's gross domestic product, or GDP, is $1.6 trillion. But if we go through the next 9 largest economies, we see here Japan and China. And most of you remember about 2 months ago, China passed Japan as being the world's second largest economy. But the most important thing I'd like to show you in this slide is that by far the largest economy in the world is the United States. And the thesis I'm going to put before you, if you remember those 4 factors that we talked about, U.S. housing market, U.S. consumer demand, U.S. bank stability, and global credit markets, 3 of those focus on the U.S. So a good question would be, why so much on the U.S.? Part of it is, most of it is, that the U.S. is a significant player in the world economy, the global economy. 70% of the U.S. gross domestic product is driven by consumer demand. So it's consumers that drive the U.S. economy. By virtue of the math, that means consumers in the U.S. drive 20% of the global economy. The bottom line there is nothing happens with a global economic recovery unless the U.S. consumer recovers with it or drives that recovery.